Good morning, I'm Chiara Perelli, and I want to introduce our work whose title is Gender Equality and Sustainable Development, How Women's Contribution to Farm Management Systems Influence the Adoption of Climate-Smart Agriculture Approach. We started our research from the role of women in sub-Saharan farming systems. We know that women are leading many agricultural activities and represent up to 50% of agricultural labor force. This means that women are farmers, workers, and entrepreneurs, but face several gender constraints that reduce their productivity, their economic growth, but also the economic growth of the entire families or entire communities. This is due to some gendered norms and customs. So this is due to cultural and institutional limits that can determine gender gaps in access to specific agricultural inputs like land, but also can influence negatively the adoption of innovative agricultural practices or sustainable practices like climate smart agriculture approach, but also can affect negatively the access to fertilizer, pesticides, or other equipments and other agricultural inputs in general. These imply important gender gaps in agricultural productivity and profits, and then can determine negative effects in terms of lower economic growth, less poverty reduction, increased inequality, and inability to mitigate or to cope with environmental problems like climate change. In our research, we focused on the role of women in the adoption of climate-smart agriculture approach. This specific approach is based on 4 different pillars: improved agronomy, integrated nutrient management, enhanced water management, and the use of tillage and residue management systems. These are the basic pillars, so the basic elements characterizing the climate-smart agriculture approach. The objective of our research can be divided into different objectives. We want to analyze the influence that women participation to farm management systems have on climate-smart agriculture adoption intensity, but we want also to identify socioeconomic and environmental factors affecting women involvement in the farm management system. To do this, we used data collected under Horizon 2020 project, the Innov Africa project. And we used data collected in 4 different countries: Ethiopia, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa. And this data collection involved 2,220 households in this area, distributed in this area. First of all, we realized a specific regression model. We used a specific regression model, a Poisson regression model. This is because we selected a dependent variable, which is a count variable, the adoption intensity of climate-smart agricultural practices. So the number of techniques or climate-smart practices used. And with reference to specific reference to the role of women in this adoption, we can see that among the variables, the significant variables, the access to higher levels of on-farm income for households headed by women can have a positive influence in the adoption intensity of climate-smart agricultural practices. This means that women with access to higher levels of on-farm income can perform better respect to a household headed by men. With reference to another important economic aspect like the access to credit, we can see that household headed by women and who have access to credit imply an increased adoption of climate smart agricultural practices. And also in this case, household managed and headed by women can perform better than men if these women have access to credit. And with reference to some social aspects, we can see that there are some differences between countries. For example, in Malawi, the participation of women in groups of interest, groups in local villages, can have a positive influence in the adoption in intensity of climate smart agricultural practices. While in Ethiopia, the female participation to these type of groups can influence negatively the adoption intensity of climate smart agricultural practices. And while in Tanzania, we have the same result obtained in Malawi. So the women participation to this type of groups of interest can positively affect the adoption intensity of climate smart agricultural practices. With reference to the participation of women in the decision-making process of a farm, we can see that also in this case, in Malawi, the participation of women in the decision-making process of a farm as part of a group, so jointly with men and other members of the family, can influence positively these, the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices. While in Tanzania, we found an opposite result. So the joint participation of men and women in the decision-making process can affect negatively this adoption intensity. After this first step, we wanted to analyze, to focus on the factors affecting the participation to the decision-making process of a farm. And we used a multinomial logistic regression model because we selected a categorical variable. As we can see from this first step of the analysis, there are a lot of similarities, but also differences among countries. A particular aspect is related to the gender of the household head. Specifically, when the household head is a man, these imply a negative influence in the participation of women in the decision making. But in this case, we consider women as a single individual. And in this case, the participation to the decision-making process imply the participation of just for a woman. So in this case, if the household head is a man, women can't be the only decision maker. Another similarity is related to the cropland ownership. In the case of households where women are the only owners of a cropland, these influence positively their participation as unique decision maker in the household, while the joint ownership of cropland can have a positive influence in this type of participation in Tanzania, but a negative effect in Ethiopia. Some other variables, important variables that can affect this participation of women as unique decision maker related to the access to extension advisory services, which has a positive effect in Malawi, or the male participation to groups of interests, which can have a negative effect in Malawi. And finally, the participation of women in activities like planting that can have a positive influence in South Africa, a positive influence in terms of participation to the decision-making process as a unique decision maker. In a second stage, we analyzed, in the same regression model, we analyzed the factors affecting the participation of women in the decision-making process as a part of a group, part of a family. So a joint decision-making process. And in this case, we can find a lot of differences. For example, in Tanzania, the cropland ownership, the joint cropland ownership can have a positive influence in the participation of women as part of a group, the participation of women in the decision-making process together with the other member of the family. And we can see also the food security level that can have a positive influence in this participation. So a higher level of food security can have a positive influence in this participation of women in the decision-making process. In Ethiopia, we have different results. Variables resulted significant are the age of the household head. So this means that young household heads can influence positively the participation of women in the decision-making process, but also the on-farm income can influence positively the participation. A higher level of the on-farm income can influence positively the participation of women. While in Malawi, we have also the number of household members as a variable that can influence this participation in the decision-making process. In South Africa, other results, we can find other results like the access of, the importance of the access to extension and advisory services. So these model reflect some differences existing between countries and differences related to the cultural aspects, but also aspects involving the context, the environment and the context. In conclusion, we can say that women result to adopt more CSA practices than men if they have high levels of income and access to credit. So if they have resources and if they can be an active part in farm activities. However, some differences persist among countries. This means that environmental aspects and social aspects can influence the participation of women in farm activities, but also the participation in the decision-making process. These imply the need for a review of government policies aimed to close this gender gap. Intervention that should be considered in the contexts characterized by an important gender gap. Okay, thank you for your attention.